This is lecture 7 in the Western Peace tradition, and I'll continue in this lecture with the Beatitudes. The third part, so it'll be part 3 of the Beatitudes, and then I'll conclude with Pauline Johnson's The Lost Island, the next in the Legends of Vancouver series. So what I basically touched on so far in part 1 and 2 of the Beatitudes is the context of the Beatitudes, the internal journey that prepares people for peacemaking and justice seeking. And what I want to do today is then reflect on the external element of peacemaking. Also in the Beatitudes, what Jesus is articulating, what does it mean to live a meaningful, an authentic, a genuine human life, a truly free human life rather than being a victim of one's own misguided desires, longings, whatever. But how should desires, longings, hopes, dreams be directed towards their proper end? And so also, as we have been reading at this point, the Catholic peace tradition. I mentioned last week that people like Lev Tolstoy, Mahatma Gandhi, Anabaptist Mennonites, Doukhobors, very much come from the Beatitudes and the Western peace traditions. The Western peace tradition, or the Catholic book we're using on the Catholic peace tradition, important to note the present Pope Francis, very much comes out of a tradition of the Beatitudes. And when he was in the United States a few years ago, he held high people like Dorothy Day, the Catholic worker, Thomas Merton, Martin Luther King Jr., and so these people, Martin Luther King, civil rights movement, Dorothy Day, Catholic worker, one coming from a Baptist tradition, Dorothy Day, a Roman Catholic, Thomas Merton, a Roman Catholic, all of their thinking, so the left wing of the Roman Catholic tradition, of which Pope Francis would have come out of, and of course he comes out of the horrendous clashes in Latin America between powerful multinational people and organizations and the fusion of that in politics and religion, and versus much more the Beatitudes tradition of what the church is meant to stand for. And so in that sense, the Beatitudes continues to play a significant role in Roman Catholic Church and the present Pope Francis. So might also just say that when we think of peacemaking, there's all these conditions that exist to get to that point. Someone just can't say, I'd like to be a peacemaker, a peacekeeper. But what Jesus is doing in the Beatitudes, he's saying, listen, what are the conditions that have to exist, not only in a person's life, but a community life, in a province or national or international, that have to exist actually to be a peacekeeper, both internal, person dealing with their black dogs inside, their shadows, their dark places, but also what's this look external in the public, the material sphere life. So for example, we want to ride a car somewhere. Well, the car has to work. You have to know how to use brakes. You have to know how to use the gas. You have to know how to drive on a highway, stay within a certain speed. Person has to know how to make sense of rules of the road. And so there are conditions that exist to drive on a road and to be safe on a road. Any other sphere of life, to get a BA, for example, it's one thing to say, I'd like to have a BA. So what are the conditions a person has to fulfill to get a BA in political science or sciences or psychology or any area? So everything has conditions that have to be fulfilled to achieve the goal that then that they've set before them. Well, peace, the Beatitudes, is no different than that. So what Jesus essentially is articulating, you say, what's the conditions, internal and external, that have to exist to live a meaningful human life versus a half-life, a shallow life, a life that is very much victims of an internal drivenness. What are the conditions of self-understanding that have to exist to live that full, meaningful life? And in the Beatitudes, Jesus is attempting to articulate a very clear means of understanding that, and then its aberration. So as I move into the latter half of the Beatitudes then, we move from the internal way of a person going into the rooms of their soul, as it were. Where is their arrogance? Where is their drivenness? Where is their egoism that has to be looked up? And how does one, in the Spanish mystical tradition, where is that nada? Where does there have to be nothingness to that, a letting go of that? So in the Spanish sense of John of the Cross, todo, a fullness will occur. And what does it mean to be empathetic or sensitive to others versus totally deaf and blind to others' needs and hopes and desires? There are some people who are so self-centered, they're not even minimally aware of others' journeys, others' lives, what's going on internally and externally in others' lives. And so Jesus is obviously trying to position things very clearly. To the degree a person lets go of their ego at a deeper level, they're able to feel with others. And then what does it mean to live that out in a meaningful way? So the first of the Beatitudes that moves into the external world, Jesus is essentially saying, he's using a very important word here in Greek, but back of it, he's talking about, oh, the divine life you will live for those who hunger and thirst. Well, first of all, these are key words in Greek. To be human, we're always hungering and thirsting for something. Humans either become consciously aware of what they're hungering for, beyond the literal level, but hungering for meaning and thirsting for meaning. And so what is worth hungering and thirsting for in our all-too-human journey? If we hunger for the wrong things, then we doom ourselves to just restlessness, just going round and round in a merry-go-round or a carousel, getting off one horse and onto another, but just going in what Rilke would call the smallest circle turns. And as the old saying, you take away, Chekhov's famous saying, or Ibsen's, I mean, if you take away a person's life lie, you take away their happiness. And so what are the life lies people have in terms of what they're hungering and thirsting for? Jesus essentially is saying the most important thing hungering and thirsting for is, the word here is dikaios, which is sometimes translated as righteousness, but which is best translated as justice. And you get Plato and Aristotle will use dikaios as a word for justice. There's another word that can be used for private righteousness in Greek, but Jesus is using the word justice here. Important that he says, but all the divine life of those who hunger and thirst for justice, for these people are going to be filled to the full. And of course, this is a Greek; it's in the progressive tense, and so it's not as if somehow by doing this things are going to work out immediately, but there is a fullness grows within a person's soul and imagination mind as they care for justice. So important to note here that that justice precedes peacemaking. Now we want to be asking here, and we settle down here for a couple of seconds, is that there's a lot of the word justice is tossed around like a frisbee a lot these days. So you have social justice warriors use the language of justice. You have liberals like John Rawls use the language of justice. George Grant, in English-speaking justice, is going to look at justice. So the word justice has come to mean, it's almost like a chameleon-like word. It changes color depending on the ideology of where a person is coming from. Or it's sometimes used in terms of the criminology system being concerned with justice. Or it's also used in terms of wealth and poverty, justice for the poor. What Jesus is getting at is something far more complex and nuanced without denying any of these things. He's trying to get at an understanding of justice that, one, goes back deep into the human soul and people dealing with the various issues within their lives. And if they're not dealt with in the name of justice, people can do a lot of hurt and harm to other people, claiming that they're standing for the important virtue of justice. And so this is why what preceded the hungering and thirsting for justice is get your inner life in order, okay? The backbone of the soul, make sure it's clean. There's no crooked lines, that a person is not motivated of anger or out of envy or vindictiveness, but that it comes from a clean place. This is why even when Jesus sits to teach, it's a Greek word for teaching out of cleanness. A person's motives are proper. And not out to be vindictive or to abuse others verbally or physically or any other ways. So the first thing then is moving out into the world of justice, but understanding what we mean by justice, because you can have people who are activists and they throw the word justice around, but they really have not thought through a much more layered and subtle way what it means. You can have other people who spend their time thinking about it but don't do anything. So between the theorist and the activist, there's a need to be much greater dancing partners in something like this. The next one that Jesus uses, because you can have people who are very concerned with justice, but they're not merciful. So the next beatitude is a counter or a companion to justice. Jesus says, "Oh, the divine life of those who are merciful, who listen, who are kind, who are there for others." And often in the clash between definitions of justice or street activism justice, there's not a lot of mercy shown, particularly to those who are seen as the opponent, the enemy, the one who has been oppressive. And so the quest for justice must always live hand in hand and side by side with the quest for mercy. And so this, some people can be so merciful they're not just at all. They're always thinking of others and and other people can be so concerned with justice they don't know how to be merciful. And the test of mercy always is how we treat those who are often seen as the opponents, the enemy, the opposition, those who have oppressed us in situation like that. So you have here what Jesus is doing when a person moves out into the larger public and community-oriented world, dealing with the hot button issues, and of course there are many of them. How does one hold together the importance of justice, but done in a merciful way? Not highlighting one or the other, but seeing that they both need to, and that's the mark of a mature person, is living with mercy and justice. Jesus then goes on, after moving from mercy, he goes back to, interestingly enough, because one is in the midst of the fray, inevitably there'll be disappointments, there's going to be betrayals, there's going to be situations in which one isn't going to be affirmed. And out of that, internally, a person can become angry, they can become bitter, they can become cynical, they can become angry, toxins can get in. And so the next, interestingly enough, is Jesus says, "Oh, the divine life, those who are," he uses the word here, and we're back to catharsis again, katharoi, are clean of heart, and so when in the midst of seeking justice and trying to be merciful, conflicts, confusions, people at one another, the tendency is to want to belong to one side or the other, or to feel that one is not understood when trying to do the best, and then of course confusion sets in. And so the process of having being clean inside, as the Greek here is katharoi to cardia. We get cardia from cardiac, or the heart. So clean of heart, these people actually are going to be the ones who see God. So you can see Jesus now moving back into the internal life after one has been engaged in the external of justice and mercy, and see that it's much more complicated. It can be a conflict, it can be a war zone. In fact, people go into it. So many just retreat from the fray because they've been hurt, they've been damaged by conflict, by verbal jousting and unkind things rhetorically said, cannons being turned on one another. So many will just retreat from the public fray. This is not Jesus' position. Jesus says you've got to be in the midst of the fray, but how you're in the midst of the fray determines whether you'll become a meaningful peacemaker. And this is why it's then after you get from the clean of heart, then Jesus moves on to the divine life of those who are makers. They're like poets of peace. They're constantly having to write on the script of history and the script of relationships, bridge building. And we all know anyone who tries to build bridges between islands and tribes, they're often seen as a traitor and shot at from both sides, because the human tendency is to be very tribal ideologically, in a variety of ways. And those who see people courting or cavorting or engaging the other tribe, the other clan, the other team, they're often seen as Judas figures. But a peacemaker is one who is always building bridges between different clans, different tribes, different ideological persuasions. Inevitably, though, as Jesus understood very clearly, when you do that, each clan will not trust you, and they'll turn their rockets and they'll turn their words on you. And so how does one maintain some sort of sanity, inner center, inner core in the midst of that? Key thing note to here is that Jesus is not isolating also justice from peace. It's about just peacemaking. And so justice goes before peacemaking. Now we do know people can be very interested in justice, but they're not very peaceful in the way they approach justice. You can have people who want peace, but they're not concerned with justice. And of course, peace and order, you get a lot of peace and order political ideologies on the right and left, but they're not very just. And so we can look at a variety of situations, say China and Hong Kong, or we can go around the world actually in something like this. We want peace. But peace on whose terms? Okay, Pax Romana or Pax Americana is about peace, but it's not about just peace. And Jesus is saying justice and peace have to go together, but also mercy has to be a part of that, and a clean heart in the midst of it also. Jesus then finishes off the Beatitude by returning to the language of, and this is where he comes back to the language of justice again. So justice is used twice, dikaios, in the Beatitudes, and so he's emphasizing that peace must always be shaped and defined by justice, because without that, peace can be used in a totalitarian way, authoritarian way that subverts justice. But if justice is not a companion and hiking on the same path with peacemaking in a clean heart, the quest for justice can be very unjust. And we do know a lot of movements in history which claimed and held high the flag of justice, but in the name of justice they were not very peaceful, and they became very, very violent in terms of the name of justice. And so Jesus in the Beatitudes, and then he sums it up by saying, if this internal and external and these complex ways are held together in a mature person's life, they'll be treated as the prophets of old. And so you get in the Beatitudes a pretty sophisticated and nuanced understanding, in one sense that takes more than a lifetime to fully understand what it means to both live a genuine, authentic, and mature life, but also to be a peacemaker, a peacekeeper, in an ongoing and meaningful way. And that's why the Beatitudes is really the Magna Carta, in some ways, of the Western peace tradition, but it brings together a variety of internal, external ways of being. Now, I'll just finish with out of Pauline Johnson, because she's very important as a First Nations peacekeeper. She herself, the early history, anyone who's followed some of the great myths of First Nations, say Hiawatha, going back to the 16th century. He was a peacekeeper, but his main opponent killed his own wife and children, and he tries to build peace, meanwhile, within the particular group he was with. War and peace. This is Tolstoy's War and Peace. Pauline Johnson, Iroquois, Mohawk, they clashed with the Hurons all the time. We in Abbotsford here, Jean Brebeuf School. Jean Brebeuf, Jesuit with the Hurons, terribly treated by the obviously the combination of the Iroquois and Mohawk, scalped. His life was a very, very sad end. And so Pauline Johnson is trying to, in one sense, and of course she comes from a family of the Six Nations, which brought together six very important First Nations tribes, bands, which had been at one another. And then she comes west, and of course she then, in her last years, is involved with the Salish, Chief Joe Capilano, and so she's a bridge builder, both within, and given her family, within her own First Nations history, but also a bridge builder between First Nations and the larger culture that she's a part of. And so the story I want to briefly touch on today is The Lost Island. The Lost Island is a story where Pauline Johnson, again, is conversing with Chief Joe Capilano. And Joe Capilano talks about, there was a time when the First Nations flourished, worked together as various bands. But with the coming, he argues with the comings, they call the pale faces or contact or white people, increasingly First Nations began to lose their language, lose their heritage, lose their dress, lose their memory, and so increasingly so, Chief Joe Capilano argues, is that the place, the people that once inhabited an area is dissipated, is disappeared like a cloud vanishing in the sky. And then he goes on to tell the story, and this loss of memory, loss of place, loss of territory. And of course the story is all told around Grouse Mountain area, the Narrows, Stanley Park area, because this is where the Capilano, the Salish were. And so it is this loss, and then he moves on to tell Pauline Johnson the story of this great chief who had immense strength, immense power. He could wrestle mountain lions and grizzlies. He was stronger, the greatest of the wolves, Lobos. He could defeat any enemy that dared to threaten his own band. But he had a vision, and in the vision, 100 years down the road, he saw a time when people would be coming. They'd be taking over the land of North Vancouver, West Vancouver, Vancouver, and they'd be setting up their own metaphorical tents and buildings. They'd create their own political system that would in fact undermine First Nations history. And he could defeat anything, this great brave, this great ruler, but he was constantly troubled by this vision that would go away, given to him by the Great Spirit. And so the story is of him this dream which troubled him and would not quit, and he constantly tried to warn his own people that much was going to be lost of what they once were, and in that losing they would become a disoriented people. And he goes up to Grouse Mountain at one point, and he tries to make sense of this vision of what he sees coming. It had been given to him by the Great Spirit. And so he then comes down and he warns his people, and they ask him what they can do, and he goes to bed that night and he never awakes. He never awakes again. And out of that, he made it clear that the First Nations, above all, there was an island that had been lost. And Chief Joe Capilano talks a lot about trying to find that lost island, where in fact the First Nations were their place of courage, their place of coming together as bands once was, but has disappeared. And so there's this constant longing for the lost island, and canoeing out at night, and in the shadow of it you think you can see it but you can't. And so between losing this island and occasionally thinking you are in the shadow of it but never being able to see it, there's this attempt to overcome a fragmentation in First Nations between what they had known, the lost island being a metaphor of who they were but is gone, occasionally living in the shadow of that lost island, but never being able to quite reach it again. And so there's a tornness in the heart of Chief Capilano as he tells this story to Pauline Johnson. And it's really a story about peacemaking. It's about what has happened to us. The metaphor of the lost island, which was in one sense is the place of Eden, in that sense is the place of any metaphorical reality or context or place in which there was more peace, harmony, people living together, the disruption that has come with that, the longing to find the place again of peace and justice, and yet never being able to locate it, and yet occasionally feeling the shadow of it within. And so between the longing to overcome conflict, disappointment, betrayal, occasionally getting a sense of the shadow, which means it is something there, but never being able to recover what that is the tension between the separation of what a person longs to find, having hints of what that might be, but never being able to inhabit that lost island again. And in this sense, the lost island motif has a lot of affinity with the Beatitudes itself, because the lost island is very, very much that place of living in a fuller, more meaningful, more just and peaceful way, and how that has been taken away from humans, and then how it leaves them floundering in the midst of longing for something more in depth, something more meaningful, and yet not being able to find that lost island anymore. Beatitudes gives a means of recovering that lost island in some ways, but always imperfectly. And so in that sense, the Beatitudes, the lost island, and the previous one, the sea serpent, are very, very important First Nations legends in terms of what prevents a person. Sea serpent obviously within the First Nations, the lost island in terms of the clash between contact, First Nations, and then this longing for this place of harmony and peace, and yet not being able to find it, and so living in the tension between longing on the one hand, occasionally the shadow, but never being able to return to the lost island. And how does one live within that tension between the two?